Welcome to the second session of Stanford's European Entrepreneurship and Innovation. My name is Burton Lee, the course instructor. Today we're going to be focusing on the Czech Republic and Slovakia with our three speakers, Andrej Kiska, Barbara Pivnicka, and Pavel Serbayo. So a lot of venture capital and quite a bit of startup experience between the three of them. And for those of us who are a little bit geographically challenged, which sometimes includes me, especially when we get into Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans, this is the territory we're talking about, Prague and Slovakia, Bratislava and Prague mostly. These are the countries we're covering this year, very heavily on the Balkans. I have some announcements for new speakers since last time that we've confirmed. Not as much on Scandinavia as we've covered in prior years, and not as much on the Iberian Peninsula as we've covered in prior years. So the course is really aimed at those students interested in understanding what's going on in Europe, who have a good understanding of Asia, who may be thinking about returning to Europe if they're European, don't really have a good overview of the broad European startup tech venture capital scene, want to understand key issues in entering the European marketplace. If you're a local entrepreneur here thinking about expanding to Europe, a US-based founder also interested in building your Europe network, and if you have a general interest in understanding different economic models, regional innovation ecosystems, Silicon Valley versus London versus Paris versus Asia, for example, then this is a very good course to get some background in comparative innovation ecosystems. So why Europe? What's so special about Europe? Well, first of all, a lot of folks here are doing Silicon Valley and Asia. There are a lot of European startups, but we've been focusing on the European tech scene since 2009. There's a lot going on in Europe. Personally, I love Europe. And just to give you an indication, some of the stuff I love about Europe, this is the astronomical clock, do I have this, how do you pronounce this, horloge?
Horloge.
Horloge.
Well, I'm Slovak, so I couldn't really tell you.
Okay. Horloge. This is the horloge. It first started running in 1410 in Prague. Last week, it was taken offline. They're going to be working on it until August to replace the metallic gears with wooden gears. So this is a very unusual piece. It's known for being one of the oldest clocks in the world. Not just telling time, but the astronomical seasons as well. So you can see it being removed. This is the clock keeper, Petr Skala. It's right in downtown Prague. This is one of the things I love about Europe is the deep history of science. Astronomy goes back centuries. And by bringing some of this history into talking about startups and tech and venture capital, we can provide some very interesting historical context, cultural context, which we don't often get here in Silicon Valley, where history means 5 years ago in the American context. So I spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic earlier this year as a visiting professor at the Czech Technical University, and I visited the Czech Technical Museum in Prague, and I really was not aware of the deep history of industry, technology, and science in Czechoslovakia before World War II. This is a shot of the ground floor, and so everything here was created, invented in the Czech Republic going back to the 1900s or earlier. You see early aircraft, you see automotive, you see trains, bicycles, racing cars. It's really an amazing industrial, technical, scientific heritage that Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, has today, which they're bringing today to play at a global level. Many of us, I certainly was not aware of it until I visited the Czech Technical Museum again last February. As I mentioned, I spent several days as a visiting professor in the electrical engineering computer science department. And then back in 1976, I also served as an intern in the physics faculty for about a month living in Prague. I wanted to experience what it was like to live under a communist regime firsthand. And I had some interesting experiences, such as being strip searched on the border by the Czech border guards on the way out, among other experiences. But this was deep communist days, just a few years after the Prague Spring in 1968, when the new metro was being built. So the metro lines were not in Prague at that time. There were big ditches in all the major streets. And so Charles University, where I was based, is one of the oldest universities in Europe. But it's not just about history. There is a lot happening in Europe today which affects us very directly here in Silicon Valley, and which can be quite scary if you don't understand what's going on. One of these up-and-coming large milestones is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is coming in at European Union level on May 25th, 2018. This is a law which is going to be implemented at national level, also across the European Union, which affects how consumer data is handled by companies, retail, e-commerce portals, any company dealing with consumer data for European consumers. It's a very important new legal development. It's the largest change in legal regime, excuse me, since the start of the internet around data protection, data handling, and it's going to affect every major internet company here in the Valley. So it's something all the legal departments here in the Valley are actively working on, along with their offices in Brussels or London. And so this is something where you see all the major US companies are paying very close attention to this to make sure they're compliant and ready to go on this. And as of last year, Gartner, for example, found that many European companies are not really yet coming to grips with this new 2018 regime. Another big, in my opinion, strategic development is a growing Europe-China axis. And we're seeing this at a very strategic level. It's being driven largely by China. Some of you may have heard of the New Silk Road. This is a really impressive vision to create an entire market all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic by rail, by air, and whatever other means. And so already, just in the past few months, there have already been trains going all the way from Beijing, Yiwu, all the way to Madrid and London without any stops, carrying Chinese traffic, cargo, all the way to Europe, and trains going in the reverse direction also. We're also seeing the beginnings of major Chinese venture capital investment in European startups, for example, which is a very new development. So I believe that China-Europe is going to be a very important competitor for Silicon Valley, that a lot of European startups will turn to the Chinese marketplace, both for customers, but also for venture finance, before the American marketplace in some cases. Those of you who been watching what's going on with VW, it's been a very interesting case of corporate malfeasance. We're talking about the Dieselgate scandal, so basically the introduction, the use of cheating software to get past US and other country emissions standards. What's been astonishing is how quickly Volkswagen has recovered from this scandal, which is actually still ongoing. They paid, I think, upwards of 30 billion fines in this country. This was an article from the Financial Times just a couple of days ago. And the new CEO, senior leadership team, have basically put this entire problem behind them. They funded most of the legal fines out of internal cash flow, and they've taken a leadership position ahead of Toyota. So they're using this disaster for VW in public relations and corporate culture to completely pivot and reorient the company. It's a very, very interesting and very surprising development. I have 6 copies of this article. Those of you who are interested, please feel free to come up and grab one at the end. So a very interesting example out of Europe in culture change and management turnaround in a very short time. Spotify is going public in a few months out of Sweden. This is Lilium, I mentioned last time, electric aircraft startup out of the Technical University of Munich, received 90 million in funding, largely from Tencent. Okay, so again, an example of very advanced technology company, transportation disruption startup coming out of Germany with very strong connections into China, both technically, but also from venture capital and market point of view. And then there's very impressive growth in Berlin, Paris, London on the startup scene. And of course, we have a very strong presence of European corporates here in the Valley going back many years. My own PhD research was funded by Daimler in the late 90s, but since then, just in the last 5 years, especially around autonomous vehicles, but also some of the family-owned companies, we're seeing many major European corporates entering the Valley as well. So family-owned enterprises is something we may touch on here later in the quarter, depending upon how the speaker lineup turns out. The point here of focusing on Europe is that if you understand the European tech growth innovation ecosystem, becomes much easier to understand how Latin America, Africa, and Asia are organized and the challenges they face in growing their emerging technology and innovation ecosystems.